Hello and welcome to part 3 of the lecture, where we will be looking at the types of metamorphism. So previously in part 2, we learned about plate tectonics and how that relates to the different types of metamorphism. So there are two approaches that we can take to classification. The first being based on the principal process or agent involved in metamorphism, and the second being based on the setting about where this happens, and we've touched that briefly in our discussion about plate tectonics, where we've looked at two different types, which is contact metamorphism and regional metamorphism. So in this section, we'll be talking more about the other types of metamorphism that we've not touched yet, and we will have a look at that in the next slide. In this section, we will be discussing the following types of metamorphism, starting off with the two that we've looked at in plate tectonics and metamorphism. So we have contact and regional metamorphism. Next, we will be looking at dynamic metamorphism, hydrothermal, shock, and burial metamorphism. Let's start off with the first type, which is contact metamorphism. And as you may recall, contact metamorphism occurs adjacent to magmatic bodies, where it gets its main heat source from. And magmatic bodies refers to any type, be it thin dikes, so it can be around dikes, or even large stocks. So basically, any rock that comes into contact with a hot magmatic body. This is where contact metamorphism happens. And as you may recall, the main agent for this would be temperature. So the resulting metamorphic rocks would form something called an aureole around the intrusion. And the size and shape of this aureole would be controlled by two things. So the first would be the nature of the pluton or the magmatic body, and the second being the nature of the country rock that it's come into contact with. So when we talk about the nature of the pluton, this depends on the size, shape, orientation, temperature, and composition of the pluton. So as you can imagine, if it was a smaller intrusion, like our dike, you would expect a smaller contact aureole. And if you had a larger intrusion, like our stock here, then you would expect a larger contact aureole, which spans over a larger area. And the second one, based on the nature of the country rocks, you would have a look at the composition of the country rocks, how deep and what metamorphic grade it was prior to intrusion, and the permeability. So these are the factors that control the size and shape of an aureole. Here is a diagram that shows an example of contact metamorphism. So we have our igneous source, and we have our different protoliths, so the different parent rocks. And in this particular example, we have shales, we have limestone, we have sandstone. So closer to our igneous source, the temperature would be higher. So we have increasing temperature in that direction. And there is a possible fluid gradient moving in that direction. And because of this fluid gradient and the increasing temperatures, there will be reactions which dictate the types of rocks created in this region of contact, where we would call this the contact aureole. So for limestone, closest to the igneous body, we have skarn, and then we will have coarse marble, and then we have fine marble closest to the protolith, the original rock, which is limestone. And as for sandstone, for example, we will have quartzite. For the shales, you will see different mineral zones, where in this zone we have cordierite sillimanite, here we have biotite andalusite, and here we have muscovite chlorite. And if you've noticed, these rocks here are all non-foliated rocks. We'll talk more about the different types of metamorphic rocks in part 5 of the lecture, but because these rocks here are affected by temperature mainly and not directed pressure, they are mostly non-foliated. But we'll have a closer look at those later. The next type of metamorphism that we will be looking at is regional metamorphism. So as the name suggests, regional metamorphism is metamorphism that affects a large body of rock, so a whole region of rock, and this covers a great lateral extent. So this is most commonly associated with convergent plate boundaries and the formation of mountain ranges. So if you remember from our discussion earlier in part 2, it would be areas like continent-continent boundaries or mountain building near volcanic arcs. And rather than focusing on the different textures in these areas such as slate, schist, gneiss, etc., because if you remember, these regions have strong directional pressure. So we have our foliated rocks here. So instead of focusing on these different textures, geologists would look at the different minerals within the rock, which show them the different grades of metamorphism. So if we look at the example below, we have these minerals here, and these are what they refer to as metamorphic index minerals. So much like the index you would have on a folder or your phone book, these index minerals will tell you where things are. Or in this case, what kind of grade of metamorphism is in that area. So here we have the different minerals, and they're arranged by the temperature ranges in which they are stable. And we'll talk about this more and why it is significant in section 4, where we discuss the different types, the different examples of metamorphism. The next type on our list is dynamic metamorphism. So from the name, we can deduce that dynamic means that it involves some kind of movement. So this is usually found near fault zones, and it refers to the breakage of rock by shearing at fault zones. So we will find fault breccias and myelinite. So the crustal location defines the type of fault modification. So if it's happening somewhere more shallow, let's use two different colors just so we can differentiate the two. So if it's more shallow, the rocks would behave in a more brittle fashion. So this gives rise to the fault breccias. So you can see here that everything's broken in a brittle manner. And the next one, if it was in a deeper part of the crust, so deeper crust, the rocks would behave in a more ductile manner. So this creates zones of highly sheared rock. So deeper, be ductile, and here you will find myelinite. Next, we have hydrothermal metamorphism, which you may be familiar with as we've looked at it at the seafloor spreading ridges. And as the name suggests, so it's hydrothermal, so water and temperature, so it's alteration by hot water. So this happens near oceanic spreading ridges where you have newly formed oceanic crust. Oh, let's change the color, oceanic crust. moving slowly away from the plate boundary. So hot water in the crust is forced to rise up because water gets heated up by the volcanic source. And this draws the much colder seawater back into the crust. And because of this system of rising, change the color again, because of the system of rising water and water being drawn back in, this makes a convective system. So the type of metamorphism here would be called hydrothermal metamorphism. The next type of metamorphism we're going to have a look at is shock metamorphism. So shock or impact metamorphism occurs at meteorite impact craters or other bolide impact craters. Basically, if you have a projectile of any kind, whether it's meteorites or asteroids, you'll find that when the projectile hits the surface, it creates a zone of melt. So if we look at the shock contours, you can see here that the closest to the projectile could reach about 50 gigapascals. And further away, it becomes less and less, because as you can expect, the region in which the projectile hits first would suffer the highest amount of pressure, and this zone closest here would be called the shock metamorphism zone. And this is where you would find minerals crystallize and recrystallize because it's melted and metamorphosed. And further out, you will find that the host rock would be fractured and brecciated because of the impact. So that is shock metamorphism, or as some would call it, impact metamorphism. Last but not least on our list is burial metamorphism. So this specifically occurs in areas that have not experienced significant deformation or orogeny. This is pure burial, rocks being buried under great depths. So this is restricted to large, relatively undisturbed sedimentary piles, and they're far away from active plate margins. So really the only thing that's helping metamorphism happen is it being buried. So there's really mild deformation, there are no igneous intrusions, and the effects are attributed to the increased temperature and pressure due to burial. One of the best examples for burial metamorphism is the Bengal fan, and this is a massive sedimentary pile that's over 22 kilometers. And this is fed by two rivers. So we have the Ganges here and the Brahmaputra River here. So it's been fed by two rivers. So you can imagine the amount of material that's being fed into this sedimentary pile. And it has the form of a sedimentary wedge that accumulates along a passive continental margin. So nothing's going to disturb this pile, it just continues to grow and bury. So extrapolating the low geothermal gradient at the surface, so if we extrapolate that to be about 18 to 22 degrees Celsius per kilometer, then at the base, it would be around 250 to 300 degrees Celsius, which is well into the metamorphic range. So the weight of the overlying sediments is sufficient compression to impart foliation. So if you imagine just a pile of sediments. So if it's heavy enough, then you will have pressure in this direction, and this is enough to impart foliation in the metamorphic rocks forming at depth. So especially the ones at the bottom of the pile, this amount of weight is sufficient for it to form foliation, and it may be even impossible to distinguish between hand specimens of a rock retrieved from these depths and one from lower grade regions of an orogenic belt. Before we conclude this part of the lecture, let us touch briefly on prograde and retrograde metamorphism. So prograde metamorphism, we have a look at the increase in metamorphic grade with time as the rock is subjected to gradually more severe conditions. So this shows a progression. So we have the increase in grade. With retrograde, it's the opposite because it goes in the decrease in grade as the rock cools. So as the rock cools and recovers from a metamorphic or igneous event. So prograde metamorphism is changes in a rock that accompany the increase in grade. Retrograde is simply the opposite, where it is any accompanying changes as the rock is cooling and recovering from a metamorphic or igneous event. So at the end of part 1 of our lecture, we touched really briefly on how studying metamorphic rocks and studying the process of metamorphism can help us to unravel the history of the Earth's crust. And this is due to the progressive nature of metamorphism. And what this means is that as a rock is adjusting to increasing temperature and increasing pressure, rather than hopping directly from an unmetamorphosed rock to a metamorphic rock, it would actually go through a sequence of mineral assemblages, and these are very specific steps that they go through to become the metamorphic rock that you would find today. So knowing that these rocks go through these steps, we can also trace back those steps to understand how it was formed all the way back to when it was a protolith. So knowing this, let's have a look at this example here. If we have a metamorphosed sedimentary rock and it's undergone a cycle of increasing grade, so we have your sedimentary rock, it's undergone an increasing grade of metamorphism followed by a decreasing grade. At what point on this path did its present mineral assemblage last equilibrate? So we have our, let's say this is the path that it's taken. So it's gone from point A to point B, where it's gone in an increase in grade and also at some point decreased. How do we know where on this path it's last equilibrated? Because metamorphic rocks maintain equilibrium as the grade increases. So where was this last stop point? So the zonal distribution of metamorphic rock types preserved in a geographic sequence of increased metamorphic grade suggests that each rock preserves the conditions of the maximum grade. And this can be found in the mineral textures, where you would find minerals of different grades forming zones. But this you will learn a bit more about when you study about metamorphic textures in the following week. And that concludes the third part in our lecture series. So just to recap what we've done so far, we're halfway through. So we've looked at the introduction to metamorphism in part 1, and here we've learned about the different agents that drive metamorphism. So we've talked about temperature, pressure, deviatoric stress, and the influence of fluids. And we also talked briefly about why we would study metamorphism. And this is because they are excellent at preserving the history in which they were formed. And next, we looked at the relationship between plate tectonics and metamorphism. So here we had a look at where metamorphism happens, specifically what types of metamorphism happens at different places. And in this particular lecture, we looked at the different types of metamorphism. So the next step in our lecture series, so part 4, we will be taking a look at examples of metamorphism in the field. So in this section, we will be looking at 5 case studies from 5 different localities and talking about what kinds of things were discovered by scientists studying these regions and how that impacts the way we look at metamorphic rocks today. And as usual, if you have any questions about this lecture, the ones before, or the ones coming up, do feel free to contact me at the email address shown on the screen. And once again, I thank you all for your attention.